I'm Brooke Smith, and this is my Unit 5 assessment. Accessibility is the ability of everyone to be able to relate to what an author is saying. The different writing styles and tones of each author can make accessibility difficult for large groups of people. Accessibility depends on the reader himself, not on the accessibility of the poem. Each reader can relate to the poem in a different way depending on his or her own personal experiences. The writer, poem, reader, and time period are all things that can affect the accessibility of poetry. The shaping of a poet's voice does not rely on the community or accessibility of the poetry. The writer's voice can be heard and interpreted by individuals and how they relate to the poem. Each person can understand a poem differently and can have a different relation to the writing. The role of accessibility in modern poetry depends on the reader and how they interpret the writing. A modern poet may not direct his or her poetry to society as a whole, so the interpretation of the poetry is based upon the experiences of the reader. What the reader takes away from the poem depends upon what the individual person is able to relate to. Accessibility does not play a major role in modern poetry because it is directed towards individual readers and not their own interpretation of the literature. Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri on September 22, 1888. He studied at Harvard University, but then traveled to Paris and ultimately settled down in England in 1914. In London, Eliot began to publish his writings and get recognition for his poetry. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948 and later died in London on January 4, 1965. One of T.S. Eliot's most famous poems is Hollow Men. The poem Hollow Men is a poem written from the perspective of men that resemble scarecrows. The poem describes the way that they are living in a place that is similar to hell. The men cannot move, talk, or even exist. The way that the men live their lives is compared to the scarecrows because scarecrows can't do anything and they can't exist because they are not human. The poem Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot is an example of a poem that does not require accessibility for a poet's voice to be heard. The poem is one that describes the feelings of scarecrows in a field and the loneliness that they feel. The sadness and agony is a tone that is not directed towards a community as a whole, but instead is directed at individuals. The poem may not make sense to everyone who reads it, but it can appeal to individuals who feel similar emotions or even just to individuals who appreciate the poem. Accessibility is not necessary in a poem such as this because it depends on the reader's interpretation. One reader may sympathize and connect with the feeling of scarecrows, while another reader may not understand the poem at all. Eliot's voice can be clearly heard and the creativity of his writing style can be seen vividly through the poem, even if the entire community does not understand the literature. While Hollow Man is not a very accessible poem, not all of T.S. Eliot's poems are inaccessible. For example, T.S. Eliot's poem Journey of the Magi is one of Eliot's poems that is very accessible. Journey of the Magi is a free verse poem that is told from the perspective of one of the three kings who is making the long journey to Bethlehem in order to bring the gifts to the baby Jesus. Journey of the Magi is a poem about the three kings' journey to bring gifts to baby Jesus. The narrator of the poem discusses the many difficulties that the travelers face on their journey, like a grumpy camel, homesickness, unfriendly towns, and having nowhere to sleep. As a result of these harsh conditions, the speaker explains that the three kings travel by night. Luckily, the travelers make it just in time to witness the birth of Jesus. However, based upon the end of the poem, it is unclear whether or not the kings feel that the journey was actually worth it. This poem can be considered an accessible poem because of its widely known plot and theme. While not everyone believes that Jesus is the Messiah, the story of Jesus' birth and his visit from the three kings is a very familiar story. This poem is accessible because so many people are familiar with the story of Jesus' birth. In addition, this poem is accessible because of the way that it is written, using such common everyday language. The easy to read and understand language is seen when T.S. Eliot writes, "Then at dawn we came to a temperate valley." This phrase is straightforward and easy to understand. The easy to read language is also seen when the narrator states, "All this was a long time ago. I remember and I would do it again." This is written in a way that is similar to everyday spoken language, making it very easy to understand. Another popular modern poet whose voice is not necessarily shaped by the accessibility of his poetry is Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon was born September 8, 1886 in Kent. He was known for being a war poet in England who wrote many autobiographies. Sassoon was also known for his bravery on the battlefield. He was nicknamed Mad Jack for his brave endeavors on the front line. He continued writing poetry after battle and was widely acknowledged for his work. He died September 1st, 1967. The poem The Wirers is a poem about the men that are responsible for repairing barbed wire along the trenches of the battlefield during World War I. The men are put in a dangerous situation and their emotions are evident in the poem. The men had to repair the wire during the middle of the night or else they could be killed. The men stood very still with little movement so that they could not be detected by the enemy. The poem describes the danger that the men were in and the severity of the job. The poem The Wirers is told from the view of the author Siegfried Sassoon. The poem is set in World War I, which is a well-known historical event. This poem has more accessibility than T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men, but has less accessibility than Eliot's poem Journey of the Magi. The poem has limited accessibility because, although World War I is a well-known event, the specifics of the war and the death that occurred there are only truly relatable to some people. While most would recognize the basic time period and emotions of fear associated with this poem, the ability to relate to being on the front lines in battle is definitely an experience only certain individuals can relate to. The accessibility of a poem is not necessarily limited to shaping of an author's voice. Both T.S. Eliot and Siegfried Sassoon's voices were clearly heard expressed in their poems. The Hollow Men, Journey of the Magi, and The Wirers. Despite the fact that Hollow Men is not a very accessible poem, Journey of the Magi is a very accessible poem, and The Wirers is somewhat accessible. Overall, the accessibility of a poem does not determine a poet's voice. A poet's voice can be clearly expressed even if the poem is not very accessible.